Okay, so part three, and the last part I'm going to be putting up today. I want to talk a bit about playing through hate. So we are a combo deck, and that means people hate us. They want to be bringing in cards that will stop us from doing what we want to do, which is just kill people with Lightning Storm. And so there's a bunch of different ways people are going to try and stop us. How can we beat these things? How do we beat the various types of combo hate that we might face? So I'm going to kind of talk about each category of it, and then what we can do to play against it. Again, this is not necessarily going to be exhaustive. I'm sure there's like some fringe hate card that I'm not going to mention here. If there is and it's something you're really concerned about, feel free to message me and I'll be happy to talk about it. I'm just going to try and touch for now on what I would consider to be the major players. So first things first, discard spells. So discard spells are really annoying for us as we are a plus B combo deck, and if they take either our A or our B, then we're just kind of left sitting, hoping we top deck another one, and sometimes we already end up in those situations where we just need to top deck and add Naus, even without facing down discard spells, and those situations really suck to be in. So how can we fight against discard spells? Well, there's a few different things we can do. One of my favorite things to do is to make our top decks as good as possible. Understand that we are going to have to play the attrition game, and so everything we should be doing is going to be setting us up for a window where we can just draw exactly what we need. If we can give ourselves 6 draw steps to hit a win, then that's not a bad place to be. Because if we can pack enough wins into our deck, then we have a mathematically sound chance of hitting it and of winning the matchup. This is sort of the classical theory against Grixis Death Shadow of playing a lot of Godheads of Awe, like 3 or 4 Godheads of Awe. Like, you just make your top decks really good. Sure, they're going to shred your hand, but then you're going to draw something, you're going to jam it, and then you're going to win because of it. Same idea against like black-green, where we want cards that you can just windmill slam off the top that win on the spot. And if you've listened to some of my other videos, you might notice that I, in general, express some amount of disdain for things that don't win on the spot. You'll see this mentioned more in the sideboarding document that I'm going to link in the description, and that I talked about in the first article or the first video on consistency, resilience, and speed, where if something doesn't win on the spot in those matchups, it's not good enough. It has to win on the spot in order to justify its inclusion as a slot for that matchup, because those matchups are about maximizing the quality of your top decks sometimes. So what else can we do to fight against discard spells? Well, one thing we can do is not play our cantrips immediately. So if we have a hand that has like an Angel's Grace and Ad Nauseam and a Sleight of Hand, and you play that Sleight of Hand on turn 1, and then let's say you get another Ad Nauseam, well, now when they Thoughtseize you, they can take your Angel's Grace and you're left with a hole in your hand. On the other hand, if you keep that Sleight of Hand in your hand and then they Thoughtseize you, and they take the Ad Nauseam, then you can use the Sleight of Hand to look for an Ad Nauseam. If they take the Angel's Grace, you can use it to look for an Angel's Grace. So saving the worst thing for a player playing discard to see when they like Thoughtseize you is going to be a hand that's like 2 lands and 5 cantrips. Because then it doesn't matter what they take. Your hand can be anything, right? And maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but still, that like heavy cantrip hands are the strongest thing you can have against discard, because there's no way to poke a hole in it, which is exactly what discard is trying to do. So unless you need to play it earlier for like mana efficiency, or you know you're not going to have a window to play the cantrip later, unless you have some situation like that, generally play your Pentad Prism first, play your Phyrexian Unlife first, play your Scrylands first even, play tapped lands first. Save your discard as long as you can, so that you can use it to look for whichever last piece you need. What else? Another important thing to do in those matchups is to get a Phyrexian Unlife down ASAP. Now, Phyrexian Unlife is very good against discard because it is a half of the combo that can sit on the table and not be taken out of your hand. So this is especially good against stuff like Shadow or things that can't remove Unlife. A little bit less true against like Black-Green where your Unlife can be removed, but it is still probably important to play one out if you can. Just understand that there's a chance it might die. And if you get that Unlife down, then again, all you're looking to do at that point is top deck and add Nauseam. And hopefully you have several draw steps to do it. And if you just rip it in any of those, then you win. And then last but not least, actually, yeah, I'd say last but not least, against discard decks, you want to prioritize mana. A way you can lose those matchups is if you're just like sitting there on 4 mana, you have combo in your hand, and then your hand gets discarded, and suddenly you just don't have enough mana to play your combo, and you're kind of getting locked out. Generally, this will happen if you're like getting locked out under a Liliana of the Veil. Maybe you have an Unlife in play, but you only have like 4 mana, and so even if you top deck the Addos, you can't immediately jam it and win. So having that mana out on the table in the form of Lotus Bloom, Pentad Prism lands, that lets you play whatever your top deck is immediately and not give your opponent a window to kill you with it. So that's cool. Okay, so that's discard. Next up, the other kind of really broad category, counter magic, and specifically I'm going to talk about this kind of leaning to counter magic out of control decks. So how do we play through counter magic? How do we beat counter magic? Well, one of the first things that you need to be doing is getting a mana advantage. So a mana advantage is a big deal against control. And this could mean a couple different things. This could mean a mana advantage in the game overall. So for example, if you have 6 mana up on turn 4, then suddenly it becomes a lot harder for them to tap out for that Jace or that Teferi or whatever, knowing that they could die at instant speed in response, than it would be for them to tap out if you were on 3 or 4 mana. So playing out your Lotus Blooms, playing out your Pentad Prisms, ensuring that you have mana acceleration to get ahead of them on mana to threaten the combo to keep their mana pinned even further is a really good way at trying to manage control. But also you need to be like trying to get a mana advantage in a specific turn. So look for windows where they tap to activate Field of Ruin, or windows where they, play a Snapcaster Opt on end step. In windows like these, sometimes they'll go from only holding 1 counterspell up to, or go from holding 2 counterspells up to holding 1 counterspell up, and that might give you a window to punish with, Silence, Grace Knowles, or whatever. Another thing you can do against counter magic is consider keeping interaction with your cantripping, even if you don't have the combo yet. Like, if you know you're going to have to play through a counterspell, then Silence is just as critical as Grace or Knowles to do that. Yeah, at least in game 1. Game 2 or game 3, maybe you have Sphinx of the Final Word, maybe you have Thoughtseize, maybe you have other cards, but the idea still stands. If you need to beat a counterspell, then the card that beats a counterspell is a critical piece of your combo turn, and it's just as important as finding an Adnos. So if you see one, take it. Unless, again, there's always an unless. Unless you know that you will not have the time to, mess around with drawing from the top of your deck anymore, and you just need to have, like, you just need to roll your dice on hoping that maybe they don't have a counterspell, something like that. So, generally that would be against decks that aren't hard control decks, and more so against decks that are aggressive but also have some counterspells. Sometimes you can afford to fight through the counterspells, sometimes you can't, and you just need to go for it and hope they don't have it. And then I guess another note on timing against control decks in particular, usually you have a mid-game window to kill them, but you don't have inevitability. Eventually it's going to get to the point where, they have 4 counterspells up and they can still, like play a Jace or something and hold up 3 of those. And at points like that, it gets a lot harder to fight through all the counter magic. You need to be doing stuff like end step Gnaws, untap, silence, 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 Gnaws to get through stuff like that. Which is kind of a big ask. And maybe you have a hand that lines up perfectly and you can do it. And I've had games where, like, oh, I finally ground out control on the 3rd ad Gnaws after playing a bunch of pacts and whatnot. But those games are not the most likely of happening. More often than not, you'll get a window sometime in the mid game where they tap a couple mana, maybe they play an opt, and so they only have 3 or 4 mana up, and in a window like that, if you have Silence, Grace, Gnaws, you probably just need to go for it, because you're not necessarily going to find a better window, because if they get enough mana, they can hold up all of the counter magic and still play out a threat. Okay, so that's, thoughts on general counter magic. What else? We got tax effects. So usually this is going to be like Thalia or Damping Sphere. I would say Damping Sphere in particular is fairly weak against Ad Nauseam. It kind of shuts off Grace, Gnaws, Lightning Storm as a kill because it's sort of 3 extra mana taxed. But the big thing against Damping Sphere is just finding a Phyrexian on life, because if you have a Phyrexian on life in play, you can usually just play right through the Damping Sphere. Even if you don't, sometimes you can just play right through the Damping Sphere anyway with Grace. Usually that would mean that you had a second extra redundant Lotus Bloom or something like that. But it's not unreasonable to just get the mana. Thalia is a bit more annoying because Thalia actively slows down your development. It shuts down your ability to chain cantrips, or sometimes it'll stall a Prism or an Unlife from coming down. But Thalia, again, we beat it the same way. We just play right through it by having more mana. Unlife is again good, so that you're being taxed less in your combo turn. And so that's going to be the general pattern with tax effects. We're not Storm where we need to cast, 20 spells in a turn. We only need to cast 2 to 3 spells in a turn to win. So playing directly through a tax effect is not unreasonable, and in fact it's our primary way of beating them. Okay, so that's tax effects. Pithing Needle effects, so Phyrexian Revoker, Pithing Needle. Usually this will name either Lightning Storm or Jace, and it just means you have to use the other win con. Sometimes maybe both get named. In that case, you got your Echoing Truth, and again, it just means you need to spend a couple extra mana. So that's kind of a common theme with beating, especially hate permanents. If you spend a couple extra mana, you can deal with it. So hate permanents are only usually effective against Ad Naus in combination with a clock. I'd say stuff like discard or counter magic, which sort of can be used reactively or proactively in order to give us a non-functional hand. That's much scarier than something like a Damping Sphere or a Pithing Needle or a Chalice even. Okay. So tax effects, pithing needle, surgical. Sometimes people will bring in surgical against you. That's always kind of a suspect thing already from their perspective, because like they need to hit something good with a discard spell and then surgical it. Otherwise, that surgical is a dead card in their hand. So really, you just beat surgical by being lucky, or I guess by not being unlucky. Because the only way surgical gets you is if you're unlucky. So sometimes it'll happen. It'll suck when it happens, but most of the time, surgical's not really going to do anything particularly effective against us. Even in combination with some discard, it has to be combined with like really heavy discard, and even then, it's not always going to do something. So the way to beat it, I guess, in those situations would be to beat it by beating the discard spells, by making your top decks as good as possible, by not exposing key combo pieces, by playing cantrips early, by saving the cantrips so that if they like discard surgical serum visions, that's much better than them discard surgicaling the Adnals that you drew off of the scries from that serum visions. You know. Okay. So how about I was just talking about how hate permanents are usually something we can deal with. There's a category of hate permanents that are not things that we can deal with by playing directly through them, and that is like Meddling Mage or Gaddock Teague, where it just outright shuts us off. So game one for those, we're kind of on finding whatever piece of main deck interaction you have. If that's a Blast Zone, if that's an Echoing Truth, if that's both, you have to have it. Meddling Mage, sometimes you can beat with Jace Spoils. In fact, if I'm playing against humans and I see that I'm playing against humans, and then I will very often be like actively cantripping for Jace immediately. And then post-wood, it's just a question of find your removal. Okay, so how about like Narset and Teferi, the new War of the Sparkwalkers? Narset is not really a big deal against control. I mean, maybe playing your Serum Visions earlier is a pretty reasonable thing you can do because of Narset, I guess. Slight doesn't actually draw a card, so Slight doesn't care about Narset. That's important to remember. Teferi is a little bit scary because he essentially just kills all of your Lotus Blooms, but that's actually the only thing he does. The only time we ever need to respond now is going to be with with the Silence List. We don't actually care about Teferi all that much, other than the fact that he might kill our Lotus Blooms. So you don't really play around Teferi that much. You still suspend your Lotus Bloom turn 1 if you have it, and you know, maybe if we are cantripping, we prioritize a Pentad Prism over a Lotus Bloom on turn 1 to play it out, or maybe we prioritize Grace over Unlife so we can't like get the Unlife bounced by his ability and set us back on tempo. So maybe you'll have slightly different cantripping decisions that you make against blue-white to account for the possibility of Teferi, but you don't necessarily change anything in your you don't respond to it in a certain way. It's just a matter of you try and insulate yourself against it as much as possible beforehand, and if it happens, it happens, and sometimes your blooms are going to get got by a Teferi and it's going to suck, but you know, I think it's only a 2 to 3 of in the deck, so, and they don't have it every time. You don't always have hands that rely on bloom, so there's some of that stuff in play. Okay, so what about artifact or enchantment removal? Well, usually this isn't something that you again deal with reactively. It just means that you try to adjust your decision making in a way that plays around it as much as possible. So if you know they're like a Nature's Claim deck, and you have a hand that relies on Pentad Prism, maybe off of a Serum Visions, you keep a second Pentad Prism, knowing that, hey, if your first Pentad Prism gets blown up, you can still win. Or maybe if you're given a choice between Grace and Unlife, you keep the Grace over the Unlife so that, you know, you're insulated against the enchantment removal. Stuff like that. In particular, with Lotus Bloom, you want to not give your opponent a window to blow it up on your upkeep if possible. So that means, like, if you can have Grace Gnaws, or at the very least Gnaws, in your hand to cast in your upkeep if they try and blow up your Bloom, that's usually a good thing to do. So, yeah, you know, this might change your cantripping decisions, but it doesn't really change how you respond in those situations. If they go to blow up Bloom, you're always just going to try and Grace Gnaws, and whether or not you have that is going to come down to how was your cantripping, what was your opening hand like, how did your opening hand mulligan decisions go, stuff like that. What did your top deck, all that. Okay, so artifact enchantment removal. There's Chalice of the Void. So Chalice of the Void kind of deserves a special mention. Chalice of the Void is like fine against Gnaws, but I wouldn't say it's particularly great. Most commonly you'll see Chalice on 1. Sometimes you might also see Chalice on 0. Chalice on 2 is probably not a thing they should do, given that it's pretty bad because the only things it's hitting is like Penthead Prism, I guess Echoing Truth. And Chalice on 3 or more should only happen if something has gone horribly wrong in the game already to get to the point where Chalice on 3 or whatever is castable. So Chalice on 0, you mostly just ignore it. If you have some blooms already suspended and then they play it, then you should, I guess, try and use your cantrips to find Echoing Truth if you really need those blooms. And in matchups where they might play Chalice on 0, specifically this really means Eldrazi trying to lean a bit on Penthead Prism over Lotus Bloom. That might be something you could do. I think for the most part they don't really have too many answers to Penthead Prism. Excuse me. Okay, so Chalice on 1. Chalice on 1 is a little bit more scary. Again, specifically, if you know you're against a Chalice deck, prioritize using your cantrips and even using spoils when you can. So what do I mean by that? I mean, like, on turn 2, let's say you're on the play, and they played, I don't know, Eldrazi Temple Pass or something. Then on turn 2, instead of playing a Penthead Prism, it might be a good idea to play both of your cantrips, and then you could play the Penthead Prism on turn 3. And just ensure that you're getting value out of your cantrips by playing them while you can, getting them under the Chalice. Now, again, this could potentially bite you in the butt, because maybe instead of Chalice, it's Thought Knot Seer, and Thought Knot Seer acts as a discard spell for the purposes of what you're trying to play around. Again, you would prefer to have your cantrips in your hand to play after the discard spell, so that you know what to try and go find with them. Another thing to do with Chalice on 1, Chalice check. I mean, I generally, so Gnaws doesn't necessarily need the Serum Visions or the Sleight of Hand in your graveyard. It doesn't actually matter if they are in your graveyard, unlike, let's say, Legacy Storm, where you have Cabal Ritual, and Cabal Ritual cares about the number of cards in your graveyard, so you might throw stuff into a Chalice just to put more stuff in your graveyard so that you can cast powered up Cabal Rituals. Adnos doesn't really have anything like that. So if you're casting stuff into a Chalice, it's usually going to be because you want it to resolve. So generally what that means is I like to try to use stuff like this in as complicated of a way as I can, so hopefully the opponent forgets about their Chalice. So like, let's say, you know, they do a couple things on their turn, and then you're like, you know, maybe ask them a question about what exactly their timing is on something, and then like they play another thing and say, okay, now in response I'm going to use this spoils or whatever. And so, like, if you have a lot of things going on, then they're more likely to forget about the Chalice. I wouldn't necessarily consider that scummy. It's just, I don't know. You're not really doing anything wrong by doing that. There's nothing that says you can't try to time your Chalice checks in for the maximum possible impact. You know, so I'm not advocating like trying to bluff your way through Chalice or calling a judge and saying, "Hey, wait, they didn't say it fast enough" or anything like that. No, no. Give your, let your opponent have the window to do it, but just try to do it in a way that might make them forget about it by playing it at a time where they might be thinking about another thing. Okay. What else? So Stony silence effects. I would say how you deal with Stony silence effects is kind of matchup dependent. You deal with them very differently out of, say, Tron, where they might have Karn the Great Creator, versus like Blue White Control, where they might have actual Stony silence, versus like, Devoted Vizier, where they might have Collector Oof. Against like Karn, for example, usually that's going to mean using Silence or Pact or whatever Thoughtseize to preemptively, I guess not Pact, but using Silence or Thoughtseize to preemptively shut it down, or using Pact to reactively shut it down. Kind of the same way you would stop Big Karn. But for something like Collector Oof, maybe it's a matter of finding the removal for it. The same way that you might want to find a removal for like Athalia or Gaddock or whatever. Collector Oof, is a little bit less threatening than something like Gaddock, and is probably comparable to something like Athalia, where you can play through it if you just have enough lands. But sometimes it's nice to be able to remove it. Actual Stony silence, again, it's not usually played as that many of, and to some extent you just ignore it, and then you just kind of hope that your draw lines up well against their draw if they do have it. So a draw that lines up well against Stony silence is going to be something that usually has a turn 3 unlife off of 3 lands, and then turn 4 you have your 4th land, Simian Spirit Guide Gnaws. That's like your ideal draw against like Artifact Hate. So the turn 4 that just doesn't use artifacts. Okay. So I think that's everything I have on my list of notes here for playing through Hate. That's not to say that there aren't other possible pieces of Hate that you would face, but I tried to touch on what I think most of the major ones are. Again, I probably missed something. If there's something I missed that you want me to talk about it, let me know. I'd be happy to. But my throat is starting to really kill me, given that I've been talking for like an hour and a half straight now. So I guess we will end it here for today. Remember what I was saying in the first video, definitely try and let me know like what type of content we like more. Do we like to see the brews? Do we like to see just like stock lists? Do we want to see some other decks, modern, either Gift Storm or Twiddle Storm, or maybe some Legacy? Did we like these sort of theory videos? I think they're pretty cool. I realized maybe I didn't have too much going on in the background, just showing lists of the decks, and for this last one, it was more relevant for like the first one where I wanted to talk about all the different deck lists. I think the next thing I'm probably going to do is maybe mess around with the either the Brinktwite one or the Wilderness Wreck one. But that's going to have to wait for probably the beginning of next week, because this weekend I'm going to be playing SCG Richmond. So hopefully that goes well. Unfortunately, I won't be playing Nauseam because at team opens, I always play the modern seat because, or not the modern, I always play the legacy seat because I really like Legacy Storm. All right, cool. Anyway, take care for now, and see you next time.